Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Meeting of the Minds webinar entitled, Why Haven't Public-Private Partnerships Caught On for Infrastructure Financing in the U.S.? My name is Jessie Feller-Hahn, and I'm the Executive Director of Meeting of the Minds. Some of you know us and some of you are new to our network. We are a global thought leadership platform with year-round programming. Our mission is to connect global urban sustainability, innovation, and technology leaders across sectors to share best practices, tools, and solutions through our blog, cityminded.org, monthly webinars, pop-up events, and our annual summit. This year, our annual summit, Meeting of the Minds 2016, convenes in the San Francisco Bay Area, October 25 to 27. A few housekeeping notes to begin. As you entered the WebEx console, you either joined us by audio broadcast or by phone, which was automatically muted. Because of our very large audience in attendance today, you will remain muted throughout the event. We will have a Q&A session during the second half of the hour. When you have a question, please enter them into the WebEx Q&A panel at the bottom right-hand corner when you think of them. Please leave the WebEx chat window, which is in the middle console, for communication to our WebEx facilitators for any problems or issues you might be experiencing. Again, please enter your questions for our speaker in the Q&A panel in the bottom right corner. We would appreciate your input regarding today's webinar. The short survey will pop up when you close your browser at the end of the event. So to get to the content, today's presenter today is Chris Hamel, who's Managing Director and Head of Municipal Finance at RBC Capital Markets. In his role, Mr. Hamel oversees one of the largest municipal finance groups in the country, which operates with operations based in New York and bankers in 27 cities across the U.S., including LA and San Francisco. RBC Capital Markets is a recognized leader in both municipal and P3 financing and ranks number 5 nationally as a negotiated lead manager for municipals. So with that, Chris, take it away.
Hey, Jess, thank you so much, and thank you, everyone, for phoning in today. My presentation today is really a collection of observations, as Jess referenced. We're a top 5 underwriter of municipal debt and really the second most active P3 investment bank in the U.S., which is part of a global franchise that does P3 in Australia, Europe, and Canada. A little bit more background about myself. I came to RBC in 2001 when they acquired the U.S. broker-dealer that I was a part of. It's really how the Royal Bank of Canada came to be active in U.S. municipal finance. I am not Canadian. I'm an American, although I do speak Canadian. Our purpose as we go about our work, either in municipal finance or P3, is really to help our clients build better communities. And pursuant to that, the goal of this presentation is really to broaden the discussion around how to positively affect the infrastructure challenge confronting our country. I think we have a rare opportunity this year to shape an agenda for whoever the next president is. Definitively, there will be a new president in 2017, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us in a variety of financial sectors, including my own in municipal finance, to really think hard about how to address this challenge, which, in my judgment, will likely involve aspects beyond, in my case, the municipal industry, but in fact include a number of financial sectors. I won't spend a lot of time on the challenge, but I think it's noteworthy just to say how substantial the challenge is. Obviously, the need is great. And the level of underfunding is significant. Frankly, our collective score is not acceptable, and that collection of observations results in kind of a routine set of tragedies almost on a weekly basis if you pay attention to the news, like many of us do who have an active interest in how to advance our infrastructure. This may be an obvious point to make in terms of what we need in terms of going forward, but we definitively believe that more funding is needed, and I point this out early in the presentation because I do think there's a substantial school of thought in the United States that has the observation that what we need is more capital, not necessarily more funding. And I reject that observation. Frankly, I think there's plenty of capital to advance the funding of United States infrastructure. What we need is a way to pay it back. And my discussion today really suggests how to better spend current funding, as well as outlining where additional funding may be forthcoming. Before I go into those observations, let me just talk a little bit about how infrastructure is addressed now in the United States. 3/4 of the infrastructure spend really comes from state and local government. That's principally financed through the U.S. municipal bond market, which again happens to be my own expertise. A little bit of the description of the muni market. It currently has outstanding about $3.7 trillion. That means that state and local government and other entities that are able to borrow in the municipal market, such as healthcare systems and universities, have issued over the years this amount of money to fund their U.S. infrastructure. And then, particularly unique to the United States, the interest on that debt is exempt from federal and state income tax, resulting in interest rates that are typically below, especially in normalized markets, U.S. Treasuries. And to be clear, that really enables governmental entities, those who can access the municipal market, to fund at a level below the best corporations in America. The other observation has to do with this decentralization. The nature of American government really favors local control, so thus we have a system of government that we kind of take for granted, but is really decentralized as compared to the rest of the world. And I'll give you one example. Canada, the mother country of my bank, is about the size of California, both from a population point of view as well as a size of the economy. I think one is 8th and the other is 9th in terms of world economies. With that as a context, Canada has about 77 local issuers of debt who do so to finance various enterprises, including infrastructure. California has nearly 4,000, and that gives you a sense of the level of just how decentralized our approach to a variety of issues are, including infrastructure. And that's one of the things I'd like to address later in my presentation. Around the world, P3 is emerging, public-private partnerships, as an alternative infrastructure delivery model. This approach is common in Western economies such as Europe, including Britain, Canada, and Australia, and it is a model that is being advanced by Washington policy types, including the Obama administration, and a variety of think tanks, including Brookings and the Clinton Global Initiative. My own observation about P3 as it is discussed in the United States is really it kind of resembles 6 blind men describing an elephant. It means very different things to different people. And part of my goal in today's presentation is to deconstruct the model to identify parts that are especially well suited for the United States. This slide has what is the generally accepted definition of P3. I won't go point by point, but in summary fashion, it's a contract between a governmental entity and a private party that details the responsibilities, the risks, and the rewards for the provision of infrastructure that remains under government control. It has a variety of building blocks which are detailed on this slide: Designbuild, Designbuild Finance, Designbuild Finance Operate and Maintain. And I've observed various combinations of that employed by a variety of state and local governments in the United States. Despite the advocacy of of Washington and others with respect to advancing the P3 infrastructure provision model. The spend in the United States for the last 25 years as it relates to the total infrastructure spend has been about 1%, and half of that has come in the last 5 years. I think that begs the obvious question, which is, why is P3 not being used more in the United States? And that's in part what I want to address in this presentation. And part of my motivation, to be honest with you, there's a lot of discussion around this topic among, international banks and global P3 players and frankly Washington policymakers. And about a year ago, I read, a representative of a well-respected international bank said that the answer was that America was xenophobic, and that this was a concept that just inconsistent with how we reacted to perhaps foreign ownership of our infrastructure. I don't think that's true. I think we could actually do better, have a better explanation, and by understanding better why it hasn't occurred, perhaps address some of the issues that would enable it to advance. My own view is this slide summarizes what I would believe are some of the reasons why P3 have not advanced more comprehensively in the United States. And if I could summarize it in a single statement, it would be as follows. If the U.S. Municipal market did not exist, the municipal market with tax-exempt bonds that I described just a moment ago, P3 would proliferate as it has in other Western economies. Let me be more specific. Municipal government can finance infrastructure cheaper than the private sector because of the federal provision for tax exemption on their debt. While this may not be the only factor that affects the analysis of a muni execution versus P3, it is an important one and frankly often prevails. Secondly, state and local government delivery model frustrates global players who are more used to centralized planning structure than they experience in other economies. Just to kind of spike this point, if you're in Spain and you wish to build an infrastructure project, you deal with Madrid. If you're in the United States and you want to build a toll road in Texas, you deal with Austin, not Washington. And I think that's been an important lesson that P3 players have in many instances learned the hard way over the last decade or so. Third, that sort of decentralized infrastructure model then leads to varying legal authorizations for P3 that really vary from state to state and even city to city. And finally, I think there's just I think this is less so today, but a common misunderstanding of P3 when it was first advanced, which is that there's a perception that if the private sector was involved, they would somehow pay for it with no governmental contribution necessary. This is clearly not the case, with P3 often requiring greater governmental contributions to address long-term maintenance contracts that often government does not otherwise provide in the budgeting process. So it's not free. It actually requires governmental monies, and frankly, I think a misunderstanding has sort of slowed the development of that, which then leads me to a core observation, which is, given the existence of the municipal market, which is globally unique to the United States, the circumstances really beg for the U.S. to develop its own unique approach to P3. Said another way, my view is that over the medium term, the municipal market and the P3 markets will converge, and I will suggest three elements of what that conversion might be. The first really relates to Designbuild, which is to say that I believe Designbuild will expand its use by state and local government. Designbuild is really at the heart of P3 and is often a less expensive way to design and build major complex projects when compared to the traditional design bid method common in government and still in some respects in the private sector across the United States. By way of background, New York has only limited authority to use Designbuild. Just 5 agencies of state government and are permitted by the state statute, and the City of New York is not permitted to use Designbuild. To assist the state and the City of New York in their advocacy for this expanded authority, RBC paid for the study, the cover of which is on this slide, which was conducted by the NYU Rudin Center of Transportation, determine what are the savings from this procurement method as a consequence of Designbuild. And while there are a number of examples, the most noteworthy one is referenced here, which is that Designbuild on the design and construction of the New York's new Tappan Zee Bridge really saved $1.1 billion over what the original estimated cost was of $5 billion. Designbuild has proliferated as a procurement method in the private sector for construction projects. I think it's increasingly growing around the United States, and I think what we'll see going forward is this method of procurement really having nothing to do necessarily with financing as a way to drive down the cost of construction projects and use existing resources in a more efficient way. The second observation I'd make is that what you'll see is this Designbuild component of P3 working with the tax-exempt markets to achieve really the best of both worlds. The lower construction cost that I just detailed that is a part of Designbuild, and the low-cost financing option that execution that really occurs through the use of tax-exempt debt. And I think the true American success story with respect to P3 uses both of these concepts, Designbuild and tax-exempt financing, to in a sector that really has advanced successfully P3, and that is in the privatized university housing market. Since 2010, more than 100 American colleges and universities have financed more than 64,000 new beds. This is because the private sector that consists of P3 sponsors are able to access the tax-exempt market to finance their projects. And it's my observation that the success of P3 in this sector really should be a model for how other infrastructure sectors should work that Washington policymakers should emulate. Finally, a little bit of discussion of what I refer to as a concept that you see in P3 that really relates to the monetization of non-core assets. I think increasingly government will look or reconsider what it needs to own to advance its core purpose. And in many cases, it may conclude that it is just enough to have access to whatever that asset is, and often cheaper, so it doesn't necessarily have to own a particular asset. I was kind of reminded of this observation when I was reading this Wall Street Journal article last year, where it was suggesting that Macys might undertake the sale of its Flagship store at its iconic location on Herald Square in New York City, and the point being that Macys doesn't need to own its store to serve its retail customers, or taking another angle on that, can it monetize this asset using the proceeds to support its core business? A good example that we've seen in the public sector on this has to do with the public power provider in San Antonio, CPS, that chose to sell its cell phone towers to a private operator. Government agencies, as many of you know, often have lots of right-of-way, a good place to site cell phone towers, but are really government agencies really in the business of maximizing the value of those towers. And so what CPS did was auction off those cell phone towers to a private party, and then in fact took the proceeds of that sale, which again had nothing to do with what their core mission was in terms of providing electricity to the San Antonio area, and they used those proceeds to pay down existing debt. I think this discussion raises a couple of fundamental policy questions, which I think, given our decentralized nature of governing, will kind of get fought out state by state and city by city. The first has to do with this public versus private question, and you see it kind of play out in lots of different ways. And I'll just, kind of phrase a few questions here to get your mind thinking about it, which is, what are we all comfortable with in terms of infrastructure being publicly or privately owned? And then think personally, what are you comfortable with? How do you feel about privately operated prisons, which have emerged really in the 90s and a little bit later than that, but that activity has kind of tailed off of late? Do the events surrounding the big news story of Flint, Michigan and their water system suggest that the private sector might have done a better job, and that water, which is overwhelmingly in the hands of the government sector, might be better properly served in the private sector? Personally, I submit that the internet and internet access is a core form of infrastructure. Certainly my two daughters would agree that internet access is likely more important to them than most other infrastructures that we think of. But with that said, we're all comfortable that the private sector provides that form of infrastructure. And so the answer to these questions will directly affect the financing available to modernize our needed and aging infrastructure. And let me just sort of frame one question about the way I think something like this could play out. Tolls are a common form of revenue raisers in the government sector to raise revenue to do new infrastructure. Do you prefer this approach, or perhaps a more private sector approach where selling the naming rights is a way to raise additional revenues to fund infrastructure? And as an investment banker, I'm agnostic. Give me a revenue stream and I can structure debt to finance more infrastructure. The point is that additional revenue sources are needed, and there are really policy choices that the public will need to weigh in on, and my own hunch is that plays itself out differently in different communities and states around the country. The second question really has to do with the private sector and the innovation that is a consequence of really the powerful and meaningful technology industry that we have in our country. State and local government depends on revenue sources that are directly tied to old economic business models and operations. I was reminded of this when I was at the Phoenix airport in the last few months and kind of reading a local newspaper story which stated that the Phoenix airport is negotiating with Uber and Lyft to pick up passengers at its terminals on the airport itself. Yet the taxi system that has the current contract to pick up passengers at that airport delivers 86% of all the transportation revenue for the Phoenix airport. So on one hand, Uber and Lyft might be a client-friendly solution that many would advocate. On the other hand, the question is how do they replace the revenue? How does the airport replace, which it's dependent upon, the revenue that it currently receives by the current taxi medallion system, which services the airport? Government entities will need to identify alternative revenue sources for needed infrastructure as American innovative technology retools our economy. Which really brings me to my last point, which is that collaboration across financial sectors and thinking outside our own silos are going to be essential to, I think, a a proper solution to this infrastructure challenge. I was reminded of this discussion when I was reading a book that came out last year called The Silo Effect. And the premise of that book is that the financial crisis that we all lived through over the last several years or so was really in part created by investment bankers who were kind of narrowly focused on their own expertise, their own product within their own business sector, not thinking much more beyond that business sector to their own company, much less the broader American economy. And I think that the infrastructure challenge and what we need to do in the coming years to address it kind of suffers from our own, and I'll speak personally for a moment, that we're captives of our own product expertise. And part of today's presentation is attempt to kind of reach out beyond just the municipal market and open up a discussion where there are multiple components of the solution coming from different financial sectors. I appreciate everyone listening to my presentation, and we'll turn it back to Jess to answer some questions now.
Thanks so much, Chris. That's great stuff. Yeah, we're going to go into a Q&A now with Chris. If you guys have questions, our attendees today, you can enter them in the bottom right-hand corner Q&A panel. We already have a bunch that have come in, so feel free to add to that. And so Chris, we'll start with one question from John Markowitz. He's asking, how does tax increment finance and special tax district finance fit into P3 in the future?
Sure. So tax increment financing is really, as my way of thinking of it, is really more a concept associated with the muni market, where a municipality to, I'll create one circumstance which is common to tax increment financing, will really encourage development in a particular area, say downtown redevelopment or the conversion of an airport site into some other kind of commercial development because the airport has been moved. And what that municipality does is premise the repayment of debt on a tax base yet to be created, and that tax base yet to be created is often then used to as a revenue source to issue municipal bonds. I think that's a terrific tool of local government around the United States, and I think it's a good example where by making tax exemption a little friendlier, a little more available to the private sector, that you could combine the efficiencies of P3 and the tax-exempt market to really go back to what I was saying before, get the best of both worlds. What I referenced in my discussion is really for the last 30 or 40 years, it's been the policy of the federal government, I think justifiably so, to really clamp down on the availability of attractive tax-exempt financing and narrow it to just governmental and other kind of providers of infrastructure, and really drive away the availability of the private sector. And that's understandable, that there is a cost to tax-exempt financing, and what the federal government wanted to do was carefully target its availability to just government and related entities. I think what you're going to see in the coming years, and the Obama administration had a proposal like this, and Senator Wyden, the senior Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee, had a proposal like this, where they propose a tweaking of the availability of tax exemption to make it available to true governmental projects that involve P3 sponsors, which in some respects is not available under some aspects of the law for a variety of sectors. And so I think tax increment financing is a tool that could be used for P3 to the extent that laws are expanded to allow private operators in particular infrastructure sectors to access it.
Great, thank you. We have a lot of questions coming in. I'm going to combine two questions, one from Adam Nicolopoulos and one from Andre Pettigrew, who are both asking, essentially, can you speak to some more examples of P3 projects and what states are getting it right, and what are they doing right, what's working and what's not working, and why are those places figuring it out? I live in New York. Maybe I didn't make that clear earlier. I really go back to this Tappan Zee project, the new Tappan Zee Bridge, where the governor and his administration have really taken what I do consider the best of both worlds. They're more efficiently building that project through the use of P3 procurement. But its ultimate financing is going to be with tax-exempt execution, and I think that that kind of combination is available for various projects in various states, but it can be cumbersome, and what I think, and this is what partly I would advocate to whoever the next president would be, is how do we make it less cumbersome so that those two projects can those two elements of efficiency can work in tandem. So the specific answer is I think the Tappan Zee Bridge is a great example of what I view the future being like. Great. Is there anywhere we can read more about the Tappan Zee project for the audience?
I can make available that Designbuild study that I referenced earlier, Jess. So if you can find a where I can send that.
So we'll add that
Great.
To the page. That's a good idea. Great. Yeah. Speaking of elections, Gail Lewis asks. Well, she says, Chris, I'm shocked by how little elected officials know about P3s and how they think it is a magic revenue source so they don't have to raise taxes. Is there an industry role in educating? The public sector don't seem to be great advocates for this. How do we educate the public sector on that?
Sure, I think absolutely. I think that, and I'll empathize for a moment with my own frustration about the discussion of this issue. I've tried, as a muni banker, I've tried to become a serious student of P3, and in part this presentation is my dissertation on what I've learned so far. And it comes back to that very first observation I made about the challenge for American infrastructure is much less a capital issue and much more a funding issue. I can't tell you how frustrating it is for me to hear smart politicians of both parties and a number of think tank types think that if only we unleashed more pension money on American infrastructure, the problem would be addressed. And it's not that I'm opposed to pension money being involved with infrastructure. There's a role to play, but somehow we need to pay it back. And so I think by sharpening the discussion a bit and educating our policymakers through this election process, I'm hopeful that when we have a new president, that this will be at the top of his or her agenda, and have meaningful reforms that really bring these markets together. And said another way, I think as practitioners, and like you all know, I'm a muni banker, I've forced myself to learn about P3. I invite my P3 brethren on this phone call and beyond to learn about the muni market. And the more we learn about each other's market, the more I think we can cobble together a really hybrid solution that policymakers will welcome.
Great. Good. Susan Crawford has a question. She asks, Chris, what's your view on the Build America Bonds program, or another route, instead of indirectly subsidizing bonds, what about providing a direct subsidy to municipal issuers of debt? Any thoughts on that?
Sure. I think the Build America Bond program of a few years ago, 09 and 10, was successful. And perhaps what I should do is explain what Build America bonds are, so to broaden the understanding of this point. In the early days of the Obama administration, the first term, his administration advanced and Congress approved the availability of what was called Build America bonds, which are not tax-exempt bonds, but taxable bonds. So the interest to the investor is taxable, not tax-exempt, but that the federal government then would directly subsidize that interest rate with payments to the municipalities that issued them, and to make sure they were tightly regulated. Only if you could only issue a Build America bond if you could issue it in the same circumstance a tax-exempt bond. Those were really well received, both nationally and frankly globally. They developed a global market for state and local taxable municipal bonds. The difficulty is that then through the budget woes of the last few years, the payments to state and local government have been constricted because of the overall budget. So what Congress and the President promised would be the level of subsidy paid directly to the state and local government has been less, and that's left a little bit of a sour taste in the mouths of chief financial officers and state and local government. With that said, I would support the advancing of a comparable bond product, but as an addition to the tax-exempt bond market that we already have, as opposed to a replacement. And frankly, I think there's, and I don't mean this critically of any government official, but I think Congress and whatever the administration is would kind of have to earn back the trust of state and local government who were promised one thing and received a lesser subsidy because of the budget challenges of the last several years.
Great. Maybe we could get a little bit more into the weeds and the details. Charlie Manger is asking, what's the typical timeline for structuring and then funding a P3 deal, and what are the major steps in the process?
Yeah, and I appreciate the question, and we'll answer it in my own way. But let me tell you, I'm not a P3 expert. I know a fair amount about P3, but I really am a municipal banker. And I think I refer you, Brookings has on its website an outstanding how-to P3 article that it published last fall, which they really did a very, very nice job on kind of detailing the various issues to be confronted by city or state officials in terms of how to advance a P3. But it does kind of boil down to, one, is the government involved comfortable with having a private party provide for what has traditionally been a governmental service, and they kind of need to sort of get over that hump. I think lots of state and local governments have done that, and they've kind of crafted solutions in their own way. But there is that threshold question then to sort of analyze doing things a different way. That's kind of one thing. The second thing is kind of getting into the design build question, which is, does your state permit, and does your state permit under state or relevant law a different procurement method that facilitates this kind of procurement versus the traditional public bid method? Third, you need a revenue source, and in the P3 world, the concept is often around availability payments, but at the end of the day, whatever the private sector is doing needs to be paid for that service, and so you need to make sure you identify a revenue source, and then there's beyond sort of the design build and the financing, which relates to the revenue source. You really got to think hard about this notion of operating and maintaining. Are you comfortable with a private party operating and maintaining the piece of infrastructure involved, and then making sure you have the funding available to not only address the financing of the project itself, but what's involved with the operation and maintenance of it as it relates to a long-term contract of paying the private sector for that purpose. That latter point, in terms of operation and maintain, is, in my view, and I want to be careful how I say this, in my view, one of the advantages of P3, although it can be costly. One thing that government does perhaps a little less well is it's very hard with the immense political pressures that all state and local governments have to go through. How do you budget for the maintenance of a road or a bridge or a water system or a sewer system or an airport over a 30-year period? And often shorter-term considerations really come to bear in terms of that long-term need, which is really in part what is driving the infrastructure challenge of our country, particularly in the older cities and states of our country, where the infrastructure is, in some cases, more than 100 years old. And so, kind of coming to grips with each of those components, and then kind of driving a policy and political consensus within the government that you're involved in is, I think, core to the process. I think that's a good summary, but I really do refer you to articles like the Brookings piece for a better and longer explanation.
Great, thanks for that. We also included the link to RBC's Design Build report in the chat window in the middle console if our attendees want to take a look at that as well. So I'm going to combine about 3 questions, one from McKay Miller, one from Mayer, and one from Nicholas Euler. They're all asking, P3s are usually associated with large infrastructure projects like highways and bridges, but these 3 attendees are wondering, do you see this translatable to funding other infrastructure, smaller infrastructure projects like fueling and charging infrastructure for hybrid vehicles or hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, or the development of areas around transit, or even smaller scale infrastructure like sidewalks or greenways? Can you elaborate, talk about how we might use this model in smaller infrastructure projects?
Sure, and I do think, I think that's all the questions have been great. I think that's a superb question, and a little bit of the unique challenge to the U.S., which is, because of our decentralized nature of government, in lots of instances, our infrastructure projects are smaller because you'll have an individual school district or a small city or a small county having to advance address its infrastructure in a fashion where, frankly, the scale is just smaller because of the size of their location, where in many places around the world, that would just be handled by a centralized government, either at the federal level or the provincial level. And so I think P3 has struggled a bit in the U.S. because, frankly, the players are really more focused on the bigger, more expensive projects, and that my hope in the next few years that by better understanding the P3 model and what its efficiencies and advantages may be, and figuring out how that might work with the traditional muni market, what will develop is for lack of a better way to say it, a kind of a middle market P3 group of sponsors who are willing to undertake kind of smaller projects that are just lower cost, something under, say, 100 million, or even under 50 million, and that is only going to come when there are better understandings of this concept and a certain that enables it to be done more efficiently. One advantage the muni market really does have is it has a well-known track record and acceptance kind of at all levels of state and local government, and it can get done relatively inexpensively and in an efficient way. That the rules of the road are known and thus easier for people to execute on in a low-cost way. I think that the more P3 that is done in the United States, the more that we'll be able to advance it in a more efficient way. The other point that I would make is, and it gets into kind of breaking down the component parts of P3. I say this not as an engineer, but as a muni investment banker. But I think it's a reasonable thing to say is, does any project benefit from design-build procurement? And that design, and as long as you have authorization to do that under your governing statutes, you can achieve one core component of the advantages of P3 just by seeing whether design-build will save money on the front end of your project.
Great, thanks for that. Maybe if you advance to your next slide, we're getting some questions about how to get in touch with you, both, even though we have a bunch more questions, Chris, but I know some folks are interested in contacting you. So if you guys want to get in touch with him, Chris's contact info is up on the screen now. And the slides will be available after the presentation. I think they might already actually be up there on our event page at cityminded.org, and we will move the event page to our homepage so you guys can all find that. So we have a lot more questions, Chris. I don't know if we'll get through all of them, but one from April Mendez, and I'm not sure if you're familiar, but she's wondering if you could elaborate on the differences between design-build and design-bid, given that design-bid results in her opinion, lower costs. Do you have any experience with design-bid?
Sure. This is really detailed well in the design-build study that I referenced earlier, Jess. So I encourage her to get a more comprehensive answer in that deck. And again, I answer this not as an engineer, but as an investment banker who's tried to come to understand what the efficiencies here. If you think about design bid, which is the traditional method, is you hire an engineer or an architect to design and build, or excuse me, design and create plans for a project, and then once those plans are done, the government agency then turns around and bids the construction contract as it relates to that design. So a few observations. And then what Designbuild does is combine those into a single function done by a single consortium of professionals. If you think about what I just said, Designbid necessitates more time. And in the construction business, time really is money. The longer it takes to do a project, the more it's going to cost. I referenced that Tappan Zee Bridge study just to give you a flavor of it. What part of the savings in that, as detailed in that study, were achieved that, to the extent Designbuild shortened the design-build timetable for the new bridge. The state, and don't quote me on this, but it's in the presentation, or it's in the study itself. I believe the state saves $200 million a year in not having to keep open the old bridge for a longer time. So just by shortening the time frame that these projects occur in, Designbuild saves money. And then secondly, there are efficiencies that are teased out in a design-build process when the professionals who are designing it are working in tandem with the professionals that are going to build it, and there are efficiencies that come from that. Any of you who have ever remodeled your kitchen and hired an architect to design your kitchen remodel, and then you find the contractor to execute those architectural plans, will know that often something is missing in translation from one to the other. And by having those two combined under a single roof, you end up with a cheaper, cost, or more effective plan.
Great. Good, good, good. And we found the Brookings report, Chris, and we've tweeted that out for all of you. If you want to go to our Twitter page, it's Meet of the Minds is our Twitter handle, so you'll see the Brookings report there, as we've also tweeted out the Designbuild study from you guys as well. So a few more questions. I think we probably have time for maybe 2 more questions. Steve Hogan's asking, Chris, why are we focused on Designbuild or alternative delivery in general when talking about P3s? It need not be limited to those delivery options. It can apply to any manner of project delivery. Any response to that?
Repeat the question. I want to make sure I understand it.
I think he's of the opinion that Designbuild, why are we focused on Designbuild when talking about P3s? And he's of the opinion it does not have to be limited to that delivery option or project delivery option. Are there other ways to deliver on projects other than Designbuild?
Well, there's certainly the existing way that we do things, which is Designbid with Municipal Execution, and there are a lot of positives to the way we do things. It is, as I detailed in my presentation, that is the dominant way of things now work, and there are certain efficiencies to it and advantages to it, which I continue to support. I don't know what he thinks may be other options, and I think part of my discussion today was to provoke others to suggest that there might be ways for us to think about things differently going forward. I think we're at a good, important inflection point in terms of this issue in our country. I think people know that it's an important issue. It may be not the top 1 or 2, 3 issues in the federal elections, but frankly, it's probably a top 5 or 6 issue. And whoever is giving the State of the Union address a year from now, I got to believe infrastructure will be a part of that. And to the extent that there are other solutions beyond the muni market, beyond Designbuild and P3, those should be on the table to sort through what the best approach is going forward.
Great. Good. I got another question. People are wondering where the presentation can be found. We just posted the link in the chat window in the middle. It's cityminded.org/cow/PPP-infrastructure-financing. So that's on our calendar page. If you all go to cityminded.org at the top bar, you'll see calendar. You can click on calendar and you'll find the webinar event page for today. Great. So we have a few, maybe one or two more questions. Let me get to, I think you already answered this. Two people had questions about how we can apply P3s to modernize and rebuild schools in the system, which is an interesting question, but I think you answered that with your answer to smaller infrastructure projects. It seems like that would be applicable in that sense, no?
Yes, I do, and understanding, and I do think this exists. Schools in some states can do design build, not in all states, and I think one prudent first step is for school financing, which is highly decentralized around the country. There are thousands of school districts around the country who largely drive their own infrastructure programs, could do design build if their state statute permitted, and it's something that's worth looking at.
Great. So one question from Nicholas Greishaber, hard to pronounce, sorry Nicholas. In today's P3 market, is there as much interest in Greenfield projects as there is in Brownfield projects? I don't know if you can touch on this, Chris. Given unknown, yeah, you go ahead.
Yeah, I would say yes. I would say that the action seems to be emerging in the greenfield space, meaning new projects, as opposed to the sale of or as opposed to P3 related to existing infrastructure. So and again, it has to do with with the various components that I detailed before, importantly, including identifying a revenue source. But yeah, I would say the focus, generally speaking, just kind of making an observation about what we're seeing out there, is more in the greenfield space.
Great. And there's been a lot of questions about where P3s are being used globally. Could you reference maybe a couple projects or what countries offer the best examples for this? I know you mentioned Canada, Australia, and the UK earlier. If you just want to elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure. I would say that in those Western economies, you're seeing it with broad application. In Canada, just to give you a sense of scale, this is one that I would observe and was meaningful to me in terms of seeing how powerful the concept is. Their air traffic control system for the entire country of Canada is a P3 project. In Europe, you see a variety of airports that have been reconfigured as P3 projects. Puerto Rico last year in the United States turned its airport into a P3 enterprise. In Australia, you see major water undertakings, water provision undertakings that are P3 projects. So really very, very kind of meaningful, at the heart of what society needs in terms of important big P3 or infrastructure projects being done on a P3 basis. Great.
Do you have any understanding of P3s being used in India by any chance?
I really can't speak to that. It's beyond my immediate knowledge.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, great. Well, we have 1 minute left. We have some questions we didn't get to. Feel free to reach out to Chris individually, or you can reach out to us at Meeting of the Minds, and we'll put you in touch with him. But we're going to have to wrap up. Chris, thank you so much for a fascinating discussion today, and I think we all learned a lot. And hopefully we will continue this conversation at Meeting of the Minds 2016 in October at our annual summit. And just a reminder, this short survey will pop up once you all close your browser. We really appreciate your feedback. We're always working on improving our monthly webinars, our blog, all of our programming. And more information on everything we do is available at cityminded.org. Our events are listed on our calendar page. Feel free to sign up for our monthly newsletter. And Chris, thanks so much again for everything.
Great, Jess. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate the invitation.
Great. Talk soon. Thanks, everybody.